About 2.5 months ago, my local Smash Ultimate community in Northeast Ohio banned Steve from practically all local and regional tournaments. This caused me to largely retire from the game, as out of principle, I wouldn't attend events where Steve was banned, as well as leave most online spaces where the Neo-Alt community gathers. While I had been primarily a Melee player for some time by then, I was an active member of the Alt community, having served on the Ohio PR panel for 2 seasons, as well as founded NeoStats, the team responsible for both the Neo Experimental Player Rankings and the Neo PR, the latter of which I served as a panel member on for both seasons of its existence so far. I received some surprised reactions when I left the scene in this way, considering I had never played Steve in a serious tournament, meaning this ban didn't directly affect me in any way. The reason I had such a drastic reaction to the community's decision is because I believe this ban to have no legitimate logical backing behind it, and that its supporters are not only willing to reject and ignore the precedent set for bans laid out by the Smash community before them, but also to jeopardize the decades of work put in by the community's founders and figureheads into legitimizing Smash as a valid competitive sport. My motives for writing this come not from a place of disdain for the players and TOs who support this movement, but from a place of love for the gaming community I poured half a decade of my life and uncountable amount of effort into. Without further ado, let's get into the reasoning behind the Steve ban and why I find these arguments to be unconvincing. I want to start off by defining some terms that are often thrown around in these kinds of discussions. The first is degeneracy. In the context of competitive games, degeneracy can be defined as something that is void of the skills traditionally required to succeed at the game. The most obvious example of a degenerate strategy is wobbling, an infinite combo in Melee performed by the ice climbers by alternating between a tilt and a pummel until the opponent is at kill percent, where the combo will be finished with the smash attack taking their stock. This can be considered degenerate because it allows ice climbers to bypass the traditional skills involved in the punish game. The second term to define is over-centralization. In the context of a competitive game, this can be defined as the excessive concentration of a technique or strategy within the metagame. The most obvious example of over-centralization in Smash was the character Meta Knight in Brawl, a character so powerful that playing him was sometimes considered a requirement in order to succeed competitively. While there were a small number of characters capable of contesting Meta Knight, he was still so strong that by 2014, 4 of the 5 best Brawl players in the world were Meta Knight solo mains. The Brawl community was forced to make a decision. You could either keep Meta Knight legal and have only him and a few other characters be viable picks for those trying to win, or you could ban him and many characters that he invalidated would suddenly become viable. The Brawl community failed to ever fully adopt the ban, critically because, when taking into account that strategies like planking were banned, Meta Knight was not degenerate, and was commonly considered among the most fun and complex characters in Brawl. The 2 examples I've given here are the same examples used by Aziz Al-Yami, also known as Hacks, to define the 3 tiers of bannability, which he used to argue for a ledge grab limit in 2019, a rule that has been universally adopted by the Melee community today. The first of these tiers is Tier 3. The least bannable of the tiers, something that would be considered a Tier 3 violation, is something that is degenerate but not over-centralizing, such as the ice climbers wobbling. A Tier 2 violation would be something that is over-centralizing but not degenerate, such as Meta Knight in Brawl. Tier 1, as you might have guessed, is something that is both over-centralizing and degenerate. These tend to warp the meta in a way that causes one strategy to become unbeatable or heavily advantageous. People who oppose a Steve ban often cite the idea that there's no precedent for a ban like this. While this is true in the context of character bans, there have been several Tier 1 violations in the history of Smash. Consider the existence of stages that allow for circle camping, the act of getting the lead and running away from the other player in a manner where it is impossible for them to catch up to you, eventually causing you to win by timeout. This is a great example of a Tier 1 violation, as if these stages are allowed, a character's viability becomes almost entirely reliant on their speed, as it's the attribute responsible for a character's ability to circle camp. The Melee, Brawl, Smash 4, and Ultimate community's decision to ban stages that allow for circle camping shows that it's the community's responsibility to acknowledge flaws in the game's design, and if they're outrageous enough, to do what we can to mitigate them through rule sets. This proves incorrect the pro-Steve sentiment that if you want Steve banned, you simply don't like the game in its quote-unquote true form. With all that said, let's discuss the issue at hand. Where does Steve fall on the tiers of bannability? Is he a big enough flaw in the game design that he needs to be mitigated? And if so, are there any steps that can be taken to do so other than a ban? Let's start with whether or not Steve is over-centralizing, as it's the easier point to discuss. The answer is no, and you can prove this by looking at several sources of data. I'd like to mention that in the following section of the video, I will be comparing Steve to top tiers from previous Smash games. This isn't to say that because those characters were not banned, neither should Steve. It's just my best attempt to give you a frame of reference for how over-centralizing Steve really is. For the first point of data, we'll compare the quantity of Meta Knight players in the 2014 Brawl rankings versus the number of Steve players on the 2022 Ult rankings. As you can see, it's not even really comparable, with Meta Knight players making up about half of all globally ranked players in Brawl. Of course, though, this isn't exactly a fair comparison, as Brawl contains significantly less characters than Ultimate. To mitigate this, we can normalize the data for roster size by multiplying the number of players for Meta Knight by the roster size of Brawl divided by the roster size of Ultimate. As you can see, Meta Knight had double the representatives in every category other than top 10, and when Steve's representation in top 10 can be boiled down to 2 players, it's easy to justify that as there simply being 2 very good players who happen to pick the same very good character, just as there are 2 Pyramithra players in the top 10. In contrast, it's much harder to say that 4 Meta Knight solo mains in the top 10 plus 2 secondaries is a sign of a healthy amount of representation in the meta. Another data point we can point to is the most recent character placement percentages from 2022, which instead of using rankings as a metric, gathers results directly from tournaments. As you can see here, Steve isn't even the most heavily represented character, instead being overtaken by Rob, who you should keep in mind as he'll be relevant later in our discussion. Now, one common counterpoint to this is the idea of social pressure. Take planking in Melee as an example. It's been argued that planking is the most effective strategy in the game despite it never being used often. This is because players feel a social pressure to not plank, as it ruins the experience not only as a player, but also as a spectator. And it is true that there is significant social pressure pushing for people to not play Steve. Nearly every top Steve player has been on the receiving end of some degree of harassment from disgruntled spectators after winning events. But I don't think this argument holds up for numerous reasons, primarily because the same thing happened in Smash 4 with the over-centralizing character Bayonetta. The spectators engaged in the exact same kinds of harassment, and despite that, numerous players switched over from their previous mains in favor of Bayo, and even beloved top players like Tweak and MKLeo picked her up as a secondary. This kind of behavior has not been replicated in Ult, and there are few enough top Steve players that we can go through each case individually to prove that. Akala, Onin, DD, and D-Dog all only started competing offline after picking up Steve. A similar situation applies to Jake, who only started competing during the online era spurred on by the pandemic. This only leaves a handful of Steve secondaries. The first of these is Mia, who's been dabbling with the character since the beginnings of his offline career earlier last year. This means that there are only 2 established offline top players who picked up Steve as a secondary, and 0 established top players who have switched to Steve as a main. This is in direct contrast to what we saw with Bayonetta in Smash 4, proving that the character is not simply held back by social pressure. Now, again, all of this isn't to say that because Bayonetta and Meta Knight were banned, Steve isn't worthy of one either. Rather, this simply goes to show that as things currently stand, Steve has not over-centralized the meta, and therefore cannot be a tier 1 or 2 violation on the bannability scale. This means that the only remaining basis for a Steve ban is the argument that he is degenerate, and therefore qualifies for a tier 3 on the bannability scale. There have been examples of the community banning things over tier 3 violations before. In Melee, wobbling, which we talked about when defining Degeneracy, has been universally banned at all notable tournaments, as well as completely patched out of the game's netplay. This is due to it allowing the Ice Climbers to obtain an objectively perfect punish game with minimal effort, allowing them to completely bypass traditional skills such as comboing, edgeguarding, maintaining advantage, and securing kills. Traditional skills can be grouped into 2 main categories, neutral game and punish game. A common talking point by people arguing for a Steve ban is that Steve skips certain parts of the game, but is that really true? Let's start with the disadvantage game. This is not listed under the 2 types of skills, but you can think of skipping disadvantage as bypassing your opponent's punish game. This would mean getting a free pass out of situations such as edgeguards, juggles, and combos. Let's go through some of these. While Steve's recovery is phenomenal in terms of distance, he's left very vulnerable for much of it, especially when recovering from below. When recovering horizontally, Steve relies heavily on minecart, which can be pretty reliably spaced around and stuffed out at a reactable range. The same applies to juggle situations where both anvil and minecart have pretty reliable counterplay. In addition to this, Steve's disadvantage tools are resources, not only in the sense that he has a limited use of each before he has to attempt to reset neutral and mine, but also in the sense that you have to wait for the items to despawn before you can use them again, effectively putting each of them on a cooldown timer where the opponent has free range to pressure Steve as much as they want. Steve has to manage these resources in the same way someone playing a more traditional character has to manage the resources of their air dodge, double jump, and other escape options. The elephant in the room here is the advanced technique known as phantom MLG. This tech allows Steve, assuming he has time to set up, to cancel hit stun for moves that are not strong enough to send him into tumble or knockdown state. Knockdown only occurs in Ultimate when a move sends the opponent into at least 80 units of knockback. This tech does allow him to negate certain otherwise true punishes and combos, and if implemented, would be considered degenerate. However, despite this tech being the turning point that caused many communities to ban him, it is yet to be used to any notable success in tournament. Many communities, including my own, even banned the character before the tech had a chance to be used in local tournaments, meaning that not only could they not see the tech in action, but they also couldn't give any time at all for counterplay to develop. On top of this, it's been proven that a tech ban is entirely enforceable. Collision 2023, a major event with over 600 entrants, banned the technique last March. There were 0 reported cases of pmlg being used successfully. In fact, the only report at all came from a bad faith actor who had lost a set and made a false claim, presumably just to waste everyone's time. Aside from all this, phantom MLG is just not that good. You can't do it after the second hit of a multi-hit. A lot of multi-hits will just connect regardless before the Steve can get out. It's just not all that useful of a tech when it comes to practical application. Now that we've established that Steve does not negate the opponent's traditional skills in the punish game, we need to establish that he himself does not negate the need for Steve players to develop a solid punish game of their own. Steve has one of the most intricate combo trees in the game. The more simple combos of his still require the Steve player to pay close attention to DI and SDI and make split-second reactions in order to follow the opponent. In addition to this, optimizing his punish game requires the mastering of several advanced techniques, such as Phantom Block Reverse, which allows him to turn around in mid-air and end a combo or intercept an opponent with a powerful back air rather than his weaker and less damaging forward air. Another advanced technique Steve has access to is a Block No Impact Land, or an NIL. This is a 2-frame input that allows you to enter a grounded state on a block much faster than normal, allowing Steve to hit aerial opponents with his grounded normals when he otherwise wouldn't be able to. This technique is required for any Steve player trying to optimize his punish game and land his infamous 0-to-death combos, which often require more than 5 of these 2-frame inputs in a row, all while following the opponent's DI and SDI, and requiring Steve to have block resources in order to pull them off in the first place. Steve undeniably not only requires traditional punish skills to succeed, but when played optimally, requires them more than most other characters on the roster. In fact, these optimizations are so difficult that no top player has been capable of consistently doing them in bracket as of right now. And perhaps the Steve with the most technical punish game of them all, Yofi, has never won an offline bracket, and went 2-2 at their only offline major, proving the Steve's skill and punish game is not enough to bypass the need for skill in neutral. Speaking of, Steve also does not bypass the traditional skills required for the neutral game. A common criticism of him is that, due to his ability to set up walls and mine behind them to gather resources, he does not have to meaningfully interact with his opponent. But this isn't true. Sure, when Steve has the lead, he is incentivized to camp out the opponent, but this is far from a uniquely Steve trait. The argument that this situation forces you into a mix-up or anything similar doesn't really hold water either, as the situation isn't really all that different from things many characters can do, such as Samus holding a charge shot under the platform or Sonic spin dashing in the corner. Another common argument I see is that this situation negates the traditional advantages of stage control, but this also isn't true. A Steve main mining behind a wall at center stage will still have more options and is in a better position than a Steve main mining behind a wall in the corner. Steve mining in front of a wall in the corner could be considered more problematic, as if he gets hit off stage here, he's able to tech and punish the opponent, giving him a unique advantage when lacking stage control. While this could be considered degenerate, this can and has been played around with things such as vertical hits, grabs and command grabs, etc. While Steve has many strengths, the vast majority of them are not Steve-specific. Think about it for a second. Extremely safe tilts with insane rewards, a combination of very good zoning and extremely good close range, a recovery with insane distance and many mix-ups, cheese 0-to-deaths off safe options. Every single one of these applies to Rob, and that character has an arguably lower barrier to entry, and by some metrics, better results. I think all of these aspects of counterplay can be seen in the set between Javi and Rezo at Smash Factor 9. After going down 0-2 with Hero and Cloud, two of Steve's worst matchups, Javi switches back to his main Wolf and proceeds to reverse 3-0 Rezo, showing patience and willingness to play the slow game against Steve, punishing his approaches and options and disadvantage amazingly, and even taking Game 5 to a timeout with a full stock lead. Javi showed extreme proficiency in the Steve matchup here, and while Rezo could have just played better, you can always make the argument that the Steve player could have just played better, just as you can always make the argument that the opponent could have just played better in the event that the Steve player won. Claiming that Steve players only lose by their own fault and that their opponent's use of counterplay was irrelevant is purposefully reductive and shows a complete lack of understanding of how competitive games actually work. Not only that, it dehumanizes Steve players by reducing them to not a player, but a problem that needs to be solved. With that, we've established that Steve is not over-centralizing and that he isn't devoid of the traditional skills required to win, and thus isn't degenerate. Because of this, we know that Steve falls nowhere on the 3 tiers of bannability, but let's take a minute and ignore everything I've just said, and simply assume that Steve is a problem. I still don't think that necessarily constitutes a ban. There's so much more we could do to mitigate this problem that isn't outright banning Steve. We could change the stage list to include stages like Lila and Yoshi's Story, which Steve can struggle on, and exclude stages that Steve is strong on. Assuming Steve needs to be banned because he's a problem under our current format is like saying Sonic should be banned due to his ability to circle camp on Hyrule Temple. While it may be degenerate or over-centralizing, there are numerous more effective ways of solving that problem. Another solution, assuming Steve is a problem, is just letting players adapt. When people bring this up, they're often met with a sarcastic response of, "Don't you think that if Steve counterplay existed, top players would have figured it out?" And no, I don't think that. Let's compare Aquila, for example, to Hungrybox. I know I'm bringing up a lot of Melee in this discussion, but that's simply because it's the game with the most history to draw from. There was once a time when HBox was the uncontested best player in the world. From March 2017 to the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020, Hungrybox won 24 major tournaments. That is the same amount of majors as everyone else on the planet won in that same time frame combined. During this time, there was a genuine part of the player base, albeit a vocal minority, who thought the rules needed to be changed specifically to counter Jigglypuff, despite Hungrybox being the only top-level representative of this character. Over time, though, the community implemented better and better counterplay, better recoveries, better kill confirms, better ways of approaching neutral. And the result? Since the pandemic began, HBox has only won a single major event. And it's not just because he fell off. It's because the community, over the course of years, managed to adapt and overcome, even when it looked like it might be impossible at first. This kind of progression lies at the core of every competitive sport in history. Given that Aquila and Onin, by far the 2 best Steve players, have only been competing for a relatively short amount of time, I don't think we've allowed counterplay to have a sufficient amount of time to develop before we make a decision as drastic as banning a character. Side note, this isn't scripted, but I've seen a lot of Ultimate players claim that Melee has a bunch of rules just for HBox. This isn't true. We have the ledge grab limit, which M2K stalled on the ledge way more than HBox. And we also have the Rising Pound stall, which HBox basically never did. So I don't know where this idea comes from, in all honesty. I really don't. But all of this has been said before. And what has the response to that always been? I don't care. It isn't about degeneracy or over-centralization or counterplay or competitive integrity or any of the talking points brought up by either side. It's about what people like and don't like. I mean, you can go to my Twitter where I posted this, and I guarantee you there will be someone who supports a Steve ban blatantly admitting this. And that's what leads to things like this. I think Waidu said it best. Banning Steve given his current results contains an implicit admission that we can ban things because we don't like them. This was simply the only logical next step. Yes, Steve players can always switch to another character, but they shouldn't have to. And at this rate, there's no guarantee the top tier they switch to won't just end up banned as well. This game means a lot to me, and even more to the hundreds of people who have dedicated their lives to proving the legitimacy of Smash Bros. As a competitive sport. Valuing what is subjectively fun over what upholds competitive integrity puts all of that in jeopardy for the sake of satisfying spectators, casual players, and competitors who don't understand what makes competitive integrity important and how it's been the spiritual core that's upheld the Smash community for the entirety of its existence. People play this game as a career. We run events with thousands of dollars and the pride of hundreds on the line, and despite that, the community has begun to spiral into a level of competitive integrity that can only be compared to a kid at a sleepover who thinks Kirby is overpowered and won't stop saying, "It's my Wii, considering that the community for Smash 6, whenever it comes out, will primarily be made up of former community members of the Ultimate community, this mindset can carry into the next game for who knows how long and potentially jeopardize the competitive integrity of every Smash game to come. I hope this video convinces at least some members of the Ultimate community to reject this movement and keep the Smash community from devolving into the thing it spent the entirety of its existence trying to separate itself from, a children's party game. Thank you for watching.